Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study series on the life and the writings of the Apostle Paul. This is the seventh and the final week of our study together that has examined what biographical details we know and can put together about this great figure of the faith's life and his times, and also that has surveyed all of the writings of the New Testament that are attributed to him and tried to look at their message and what was on Paul's heart as he wrote, as a way of understanding more about his message to us in his writings that God had given him to give to us, and also the life experiences that God had ordained for him to have that impact those writings. So thank you again for studying with us. I hope you've been enjoying the study and finding it useful and productive. It really is one of my favorites, and I'm going to miss it when it's over, but we're excited about the next series that we'll be beginning next week for the season of Lent. So when we're done today, wrapping up the series on the Apostle Paul, we'll give you a brief preview of what that new series is going to be. But for now, it's time to jump back in and finish surveying all of the books of the New Testament that are attributed to Paul. We have just a handful left, and they're Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. So, time to get started. We'll begin with the book of Hebrews, but before we go about the task of trying to date this letter, it's definitely worth noting that Hebrews is no stranger to controversy when it comes to identifying its author. The church has traditionally and historically taught that it's yet another masterful work of the Apostle Paul. And there are several very understandable and very good reasons to hold this position. One such reason has to do with copies of the text that we have, as biblical letters were often collected together in various groups before the canonization process. And these groups that had collected the letters, these volumes, were called codices. That's the plural for the word codex. One of these codices is the famous Chester Beatty Biblical Papyrus II, which itself has an interesting story. Chester Beatty Biblical Papyrus II is one codex among several that were among the personal collection of, you may have guessed it, a man named Chester Beatty. The codex began its life sometime in the mid-200s AD, though the precise date of its manufacture, or its writing, if you prefer, isn't really known. To be honest, much of its history during the first 1700 years of its existence is shrouded in mystery, but it's believed that illegal antiquities traders came into possession of it sometime in the late 19th or perhaps very early 20th century, maybe even digging it up out of the ground from a Coptic church's graveyard, as goes the most interesting and kind of gruesome legend about its origins. Beatty was a rich American mining magnate with an interest in collecting ancient texts, and when word reached him in 1931 that these illicit dealers had a hold of something of great importance, he jumped at the chance to add it to his collection. He immediately made the codex available to scholars to investigate, something that its previous history, with its nefarious owners up until he had gotten a hold of it, had never permitted to happen. Beatty, meanwhile, contributed substantial quantities of copper and other raw materials to the Allied war effort in the 1940s, and he eventually relocated to the United Kingdom and received a knighthood from Elizabeth II. But he became disenchanted with UK politics in the 1950s after the rise of the Labour Party and eventually retired to Ireland and donated all of his library to the British Crown, including this papyrus. Chester Beatty Biblical Papyrus II, again dating from the mid-200s, places Hebrews alongside uncontested letters of the Apostle Paul, a very strong indication that has come to us in modern times that very early on the church recognized this book, Hebrews, as a genuine Pauline work. And yet, within the text itself, one of the key ingredients we've seen in other Pauline epistles is entirely absent. There is no opening salutation, meaning the writer does not identify himself, as Paul has always done, and neither does he indicate the letter's intended recipients. On the other hand, the letter does include various greetings and instructions at its end, which is very typical of Paul's letters, but the writer also does not identify himself within those greetings, and such greetings were actually a really common feature of a lot of letter writing that was happening at this time in the ancient world. But on the other hand, and as you can see, we're running out of hands here, Timothy's close association with Paul and the mention of Timothy within Hebrews seems to fall into the category of maybe Paul really did write this. On the other hand, the vocabulary and the language and some of the imagery that's used and the overall thrust of the argument doesn't really seem to track with other books of Paul. So the debate just seems to go round and round and round of who actually wrote this. For his part, Harold Watkins, whose work we've been leaning on really heavily in this study as we've looked at Paul's books and as we've assembled a bit of a timeline of Paul's missionary journeys and where the letters fall within those journeys, Harold Watkins theorizes that Hebrews is a genuine work of Paul and that it is in fact the same work of Paul that Peter mentions in 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 11 through 16, saying that this letter is, quote, hard to understand, and this certainly seems plausible. In that case, Watkins theorizes that the book was written in about 62 AD, after Paul's appeal is heard in Rome. If Peter is not referencing Hebrews, it may be the case that the letter he does have in mind was simply lost to history and that we have no record of it. Another theory, and one that I personally tend to lean toward, is that Hebrews doesn't begin like a letter because it's not a letter at all. Perhaps it's a copy of a sermon that was written down so that it could be circulated among many different churches. Perhaps Paul had a hand in crafting the sermon alongside some of his close associates like Priscilla and Aquila, or even Timothy himself. Perhaps the greetings at the end of this letter that we have in our manuscripts were simply added to the original copy of the sermon as a way of saying hello to the people who would receive this copy. Kind of like when you would copy a document you want a friend to see, and you put a post-it note on it that says, "Hi friend, I thought you might really enjoy this. Say hi to the family for me. Bye-bye." So it might be a case like that. But either way, Hebrews' energetic argument and its energetic treatment of the new covenant fulfilling the old covenant and the superiority of Jesus to the previous system of animal sacrifice under the law was a powerful tool for communicating the gospel to the world, especially to committed Jews who knew their history and were skeptical of this world-changing event that had occurred in the resurrection of Jesus. Hebrews is a fascinating book that's well worth its own study sometime, and perhaps we'll get a chance to do that as the weeks and the months go on, maybe when we're back together, which we hope is very soon. So the remaining 3 letters of Paul in the New Testament are often grouped together under the title of the pastoral epistles, as the 2 recipients of these 3 letters, Timothy and Titus, were both pastoring churches when they received them. The pastoral epistles don't seem to reference any event or any scenario that's recorded within the book of Acts, so it's believed that they were written fairly late in Paul's life. Paul was released from Roman custody in 62 AD after his appeal was heard, and he continued his evangelistic work in Western Europe until his arrest after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. So all 3 of these letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, can be dated as being written between 63 and 66 AD. We will begin with the letter to Titus. We don't know where Paul was when he wrote this letter, but we do know where Titus was. Titus was on the island of Crete, where he and Paul had spent time sharing the gospel and building a Christian community before other business or new opportunities called Paul away from the island. The letter serves as a reminder to Titus about the task that Paul had entrusted to him, and as a sort of instruction manual for how best to go about accomplishing that task. In these very personal letters, which were not meant for wide distribution among the churches, or probably not meant to be read in public in a worship service, we find perhaps a more relaxed and oftentimes more curmudgeonly Apostle Paul. He reiterates the stereotype that Cretans are, quote, liars and vicious brutes and lazy gluttons, and points out that this stereotype was first entered into the literature by a Cretan himself. Paul contrasts these alarming qualities of the Cretans with the qualities and qualifications that elders in the church should possess and should also demonstrate through their lives. And he urges Titus to find individuals who break the usual Cretan mold. He fears that good leaders will be difficult to find, and that the churches on the island may succumb to false teaching, once again, about circumcision. Interestingly enough, there are quite a few similarities between Titus and the book of 1 Timothy, which was also written sometime in this 63 to early 64 AD timeframe. Once again, we don't know where Paul was when he's writing 1 Timothy, since it's being produced outside that period of time chronicled by Luke in the book of Acts. And we don't have any information about Paul's whereabouts to compare against whatever circumstances we could determine are at hand in the text itself. However, we can be fairly sure that the letter's recipient, Timothy, is in Ephesus, tending to the churches there. One of Paul's worries about the church on the island of Crete is the very same worry that he has for the churches in Ephesus. He labels the matter a meaningless argument over genealogies, indicating that this is another expression of the Roman church's struggle. That is, one group claiming that they are superior to another group by virtue of their heritage or their ancestors. It's very possible that this was, at its heart, an argument over whether Gentiles, who had no connection to the blood of the Jewish people, they had no relationship to that family, they did not descend from the same people that the Jewish people descended from, they had no connection to these famous forefathers. Were they then the same as the Jewish people of God? Were they worth the same to the church if they had no such heritage? Two individuals in particular are at the heart of this controversy in Ephesus, and Paul decides he's going to name names. Hymenaeus and Alexander are the culprits, and Paul is almost shockingly blunt. He has said that he is turning them over to Satan. Again, this is the unfiltered, uncensored Paul communicating directly to a trusted friend, as opposed to Paul diplomatically approaching a church through a letter. So that may account for some of the frustration and the more angry tone that we read here. But historically, the church has recognized the importance of Paul's warnings and his wisdom in these books to find them in our biblical canon and to include them in that. Nevertheless, this can sometimes be kind of troubling language. Paul bookends the first two chapters of 1 Timothy with an exhortation to fight the good fight of faith. And certainly there is an element of necessary confrontation with and struggle against the false teaching going on in Ephesus and on Crete, issues that are dividing these churches. But ultimately, the good fight of faith is not a military campaign that vanquishes and destroys those that would attack the church. Even when Paul announces that he is handing Hymenaeus and Alexander over to Satan, he says he's doing so not so that they may be devoured or annihilated, but so that they may learn how not to blaspheme, that they may learn how to repent, and to eventually be restored to God. Being a good fighter means perseverance and a willingness to suffer blows and absorb injury to oneself on behalf of those one is fighting to protect, even if those you're trying to protect are the ones landing the blows on you themselves. Paul encourages Timothy to rely on his faith in God as he fights this good fight in Ephesus. And as we come to this next letter that we have for us, 2 Timothy, our last one, we'll find that Paul has expanded and transformed this metaphor of a steadfast soldier or an unyielding boxer into a tale of a diligent runner engaged in the lengthy and draining race. And in this new analogy, we can see a glimpse, perhaps, of Paul's own understanding that his race, and all its drama, and all its suffering, and in all its glory for the risen Jesus, is coming to an end. In our timeline, the last letter of Paul in the New Testament is 2 Timothy, which was probably written around 66 AD. Earlier in our study, when we examined the book of Philippians, we noted the hopeful tone of Paul as he awaited the Emperor Claudius to hear his appeal from the charges of treason brought against him by the temple leadership in Jerusalem. 4 years after writing Philippians, a great deal has changed in the empire. Nero is now the emperor. Paul has been arrested and returned to Rome, and he sits in prison, no longer awaiting trial, but likely awaiting execution. The sanguine notes of Philippians have disappeared, but there remains in Paul's writing a great confidence in the love of Jesus amidst resignation over what is to come. As we find Paul in these circumstances, I'm reminded of the words of Jesus to Ananias in describing his will and his plan for Paul's career as an apostle of Christ. Jesus said in Acts 9, "Paul is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." Indeed, it's almost impossible not to notice the funereal feeling of one of the letter's final lines as he addresses Timothy, his son, in the faith. "And as for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." Paul clearly believes that he has reached the end of his life, which gives us a fair amount of confidence in dating 2 Timothy in 66 AD, after Paul has been falsely convicted for involvement in the Great Fire of Rome, and just prior to his execution along with the Apostle Peter. Some evidence within 2 Timothy indicates that Paul may have faced two charges against him. Chapter 4, verses 16 through 18, could be understood to mean that Paul was initially acquitted of the charge that he had participated in starting the fire, which would make some logical sense, as it's unlikely that Paul was even in Rome at the time of the fire. But the second charge was far more serious, and almost impossible to defend against: the introduction of a new religion. For the Romans, the emperor was divine, and Nero was particularly serious that he be treated as such. To introduce or advocate a new religion that directly challenged Nero's claims of divinity, and instead claimed that a Jewish man from a remote territory occupied by the empire was actually the divine king of all kings and the Lord of the world, was strictly forbidden. It was more than heresy. It was sedition. And against the charge of not believing that the emperor was his divine hope, and instead placing all his hope in Jesus, Paul could offer no defense and could claim no innocence. As such, he expected no mercy from Nero, no commutation of sentence, no sudden stay of the emperor's hand, and indeed, he received none. In 66 AD, at the approximate age of about 60 years old, 33 years after he had met the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus, after journeying thousands of miles in service to that same Lord, establishing churches, nurturing the faith of so many, and bringing the gospel to the Gentile peoples of the world, Paul's long race was finished when he was beheaded by the Roman state. And yet his intellect, his courage, his example, his faith, and his legacy live on 2,000 years later through these most precious and powerful letters that he wrote, and the central message that he has for you and for me, that because of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, we, the Gentile peoples of the world, are now a part of the beloved Israel of God. And for all this, we praise God for his servant Paul. Now, part of being included in Israel is living up to that name, that is, those who wrestle with God. And as the season of Lent begins, and as we set our minds and our hearts on preparing for Easter, we're going to engage in some of that struggling together. For the next few weeks, we will study some difficult sayings of Jesus from his teachings that we have in the four Gospels. Sayings and teachings that can be confusing, or can be alarming, or just plain old difficult to understand what Jesus is trying to say. Our goal is better understanding of what Jesus is communicating to us, and so hopefully to better understand the heart of God. I hope you'll join us for that next series. Until then, the Lord bless you this week, and we'll see you next time.